What's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you are doing well. It's been such an eventful week. I don't even know where to begin. It was like an endless election, and there's been so much discussion, and the news is buzzing. There are all sorts of debates, and of course, where you stand depends on where you sit. And we have a variety of opinions about the election. But I think that without a doubt, many of us are breathing a sigh of relief and we're sort of apprehensive about what comes next. But without a doubt, things are kind of looking up in a variety of ways. I think that the United States in its relationship with Latin America will also evolve in ways that might be positive and interesting to behold. And I think that it's a really interesting time for us to be here in a class like this, where we can talk about politics in the Americas. And notice that I say the Americas, and I'm referring to not just Latin America, but also the United States, because after all, it is part of what at large is America. And in fact, as I've said before, a lot of Latin Americans see a lot of similarities between their experience and ours, especially in the last 4 years. And so it's just such an interesting time. And if you're like me, you were on the edge of your seat for most of the week. And to some degree, I'm still on the edge of my seat because we still have a couple months before the new administration takes power, and a lot could happen in those couple months. In the meantime, lawsuits have been waged, and there is all sorts of activity in the courts related to the election. Although, how valid some of these cases are is in question. Before we get started, I just think that it's useful for us to just chat for a moment and maybe talk about what we think about the election, what thoughts we have, what the future might hold, just how you feel about it. And I'd like to hear from as many of you as possible. We'll just do this for a few minutes just to kind of loosen up a little bit and get comfortable before we begin discussing corruption, which I'm very excited to continue discussing with you. We're going to take a look at some cases, watch some videos. Eventually, we'll answer some questions and have a discussion about the situation in Latin America, and also maybe our own personal experiences with corruption, maybe in our relations with the police or public officials or whatever we've maybe experienced in Latin America. But before we get there, let's just sit back for a moment, and you can comment using the chat or you can speak up using the mic as always, but let's just take a second and kind of reflect a little bit. What thoughts do you have about the election?
Um, Hi guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
First off, I kind of just want to relax everybody because we all know Vox is a reputable news source. A little left-leaning, but I did see one of their publications and they pointed out that all these lawsuits so far are petty claims that are likely to be thrown out. For instance, in Nevada, it's about like 200, 2,000. They accuse 2,000 dead people of voting, or in Georgia, it's about 300 ballots that are wrong. It's only like in the hundreds or a few thousand, and Joe Biden has leads of more than that in all these states where these baseless, like petty lawsuits are being filed. So I really don't think we need to worry too much about Trump taking the election from us. I guess the only thing to be more worried about is the Supreme Court, but I still don't think that they're going to do anything that's going to hand Trump the election per se, considering Joe Biden still has leads in all these other states except North Carolina. So yeah.
Yeah, that was my impression too. Even if these lawsuits go forward and are deemed valid, which many of them haven't been, the margins of victory for Joe Biden are so huge compared to the number of votes in question in these lawsuits that even if the lawsuits were accepted and the courts were to rule in Trump's favor, it wouldn't change the result. And I think, moreover, to add to Quinn's point, the Supreme Court can only take up a case if it has a valid basis, right? If it's a real case that really is in doubt or is in question. And, you know, it looks like none of these are very valid. And even if they are, they can be decided at lower courts and they won't change the actual result. And so the politics of this we can set aside. Um, I think because, on a procedural level, it appears as though the contest has been decided, and I don't know what would change the outcome. But thank you, Quinn, for adding that. That is interesting information, and this is what I also had kind of absorbed as well. What do the rest of you all think?
So my opinion is a bit more gloomier than I think most of the people who will come on the mic will be. But I think while Trump was repudiated, his message wasn't. And that was very clearly demonstrated through the down ballot races where Democrats now have to win two Senate seats that are currently held by incumbent Republicans in Georgia in order to take back the Senate and to have even a chance of pushing through an agenda that Biden wants, because he'll be the first president in I think 30 years, maybe more, to face divided government on his first day in administration. And Democrats are also facing losses in the House, which is going to leave them with still a majority, but smaller than it was before. So any ideas that the Democrats wanted to do, whether it was like eliminating the filibuster or making DC and Puerto Rico states, are are now just out the window. And with that, I think a lot of media is rightfully focused on Trump, but I think the Democratic Party lost this election.
Yeah, I agree, Ishan, and I'm equally gloomy. It's kind of a sobering victory in the sense that the Democrats appear to have won the presidency, but nothing else, and they lost ground in the House. And unless they win those two hotly contested races in Georgia, those runoffs, they're not going to have the majority that they need to govern. And so what that means in turn is that it's very likely that not only will Biden not be able to accomplish virtually any of his agenda, he'll probably also have to create a cabinet that's friendly to the right in a variety of ways, because the Senate holds the key to those nominations and those approvals in the Senate. The Republicans hold the key, I meant to say. And what that means then in turn is that everything from a healthcare overhaul to remedying the student debt crisis to even something simple like an economic stimulus to respond to COVID effectively, all of those things are out the window. And I actually want to go further and say something that I now see more clearly. Many of you may know that Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, rejected an offer by the Republicans and Trump to push through an economic stimulus right before the election. And although that deal in that piece of legislation had a lot of strings attached, Nancy Pelosi rejected it for political reasons. I now think that that was a mistake because the Democrats won the presidency and they didn't win the Senate or the House. And now we're almost entirely unlikely to get any kind of an economic stimulus now that the election has been carried out and it's over. And so I think that that was a mistake in addition to the losses in this election. And so it is gloomy. And I think really the only thing that we can say here is that we stemmed the tide of authoritarianism. We can't really say much else, but we're now facing something that's really equally daunting, frankly, which is the peril of presidentialism. We now face that crisis that has affected so many Latin American countries, which is that gridlock between the presidency and the Congress. And so what happens from here is really anyone's guess, although I think it's certainly going to be very, very difficult to govern effectively. And although executive orders might be effective in rolling back some of the changes made by Trump, legislatively, the Democrats will be in a difficult position. Sad to say. Let's hear from some others.
I kind of want to add on a little bit to Ishan's point, and also, I guess, add a little bit of a, depending on how you view on it, is add a more like sweet spin to it. We saw a lot of Democratic losses when it comes to the House, but a lot of those losses were in more career politicians, more established Democratic members, but we saw wins in areas with newcomers. So I mentioned last week, we had 4 new members of the squad. We have our first openly transgender senator from, I don't remember what state. I forgot their name, and I feel
Oregon?
bad about it. Is it Oregon?
It might be. I can't remember, but I did see that headline. I was excited about that too.
And we have two openly gay African American representatives, and I forgot who and we have a handful of Native American and Native Hawaiian representatives going to the House. So where Democrats lost in their historic group, a lot of newcomers have come into the table at this election. So it's interesting to see that this shift has happened, and it's going to be interesting to see how they act now that more minority groups are in a position of power in regards to the House.
That's a great point, Christian. That even if they did lose some ground, the composition of their bloc is changing and improving from the vantage point of descriptive representation and representing the whole swath of interests and identities that fall under the Democratic Party's constituency. And I'm really happy to see that too. And I think that that's a reflection of the changes in society. And I've talked about it before. Younger people demographically are different than these older generations. And so the Congress is going to begin to change. The Democratic Party is going to change. The Republican Party is going to change, maybe more slowly, but it will. And so that's a win. And in putting the balance of power aside, that's a win. And I agree. And what I'd like to see in particular, I'd like to see more Native American representatives, and especially in places in like the Great Plains states where they were especially concentrated, and where reservations exist in larger numbers, and where the social problems afflicting them are especially pronounced. And so I'm right there with you, and representation is part of democracy. And just like in Latin American democracies, we want to advance representation as much as possible. And so putting the balance of power aside, those are all positive developments for sure. Hi, Adi. Yes, I'm doing great. Thank you. Good evening, Sarah. Hi, Landra. Christian says, yes, it's been a lot, but 2020 is consistent at least. Longest 3 days ever. 80s parents were moving, a lot of work. That's okay, no worries. Maricela says, Oh, yes, please, go ahead. Sorry, Claire.
I'd just like to add, like, even though I feel like the Democratic Party did lose, in a sense, when it comes to the House and Congress, I think that with like the new president that we would have, I feel like we would have some sort of like unity back in the country, which I feel like could really change how like the House and like Congress would kind of like act. I feel like if the president can kind of find like a middle between both parties, I feel like it could kind of just change everything. I know that's like something like shooting high, but I feel like if Joe Biden could like bring some sense of unity to between the Republican and Democratic Party, I feel like it wouldn't completely be a loss to the Democratic Party, because we did see when Trump, well, he still is president, but as he continues to be president, the division between the two parties were really like seen. So I feel like if Joe Biden could bring some sort of like unity, I feel like we could have a possibility of like meeting in the middle with the two parties.
Yeah, I hope so too. I mean, I can't help but think back to the Obama years when they blocked the Merrick Garland nomination for more than a year just because he was a Democrat. And, the Tea Party emerged on the far right of the Republican Party right when Obama was elected. And Obama himself was a moderate centrist, and obviously he was Black, and we could be frank about it. It could have been racism that motivated the Republican Party's unwillingness to work with him, or even like acknowledge him, or even give his nominee a hearing. If that's the case, maybe Joe Biden will be more successful. I certainly hope so. But I do worry that the polarization is so extreme that it might be even more difficult to govern now than it was during the Obama years. And we know, for example, that in countries in Latin America, like say, Ecuador in the 90s and the early 2000s, maybe Peru, even Chile. We know that polarization has made it often very difficult to govern, and we'll see. We'll see. I hope that Joe Biden is that unifying force. He certainly does often speak in this kind of way. He says, first and foremost, I'm the president of everyone. And that's a positive message. I think one question is, how will Trump relate to his followers, and how will he continue to influence the Republican Party even after he leaves power? And could that influence the way that the Republican Party works with or doesn't work with the Democrats? And so, Clarissa, I'm crossing my fingers, and I think that if there's anyone in the Democratic Party who might be able to do this, I actually do think it's Biden, really. I really do think so. And to some degree, it may have been the case that he was elected precisely because he's relatively moderate and he was able to catch independents, as well as some new voters, and of course the Democratic Party. So we'll see. We'll see. I hope that he can compose a cabinet that is friendly to the Democratic Party, and that doesn't have to compromise some of the agenda that was put together in the run up to this election. But we'll have to wait and see. We have a couple months before things really kind of come together. In the short term, Biden's already begun to announce potential nominees, and it has been the case so far that many of these people are pretty moderate. There's even some talk about some Republicans ending up in there. And interestingly, maybe that would open up the Republican Party to working with Biden on certain issues. I certainly hope that it doesn't require Biden to compromise some of his own agenda. And I certainly hope that he doesn't pass legislation that is Republican legislation. I'm just going to be honest. I have my bias, just like all of you. I won't pretend not to have an opinion, but I vouch and I promote the cause of the working class and minorities and indigenous people. And I believe that social justice and progressive values are really better served, often under Democratic administrations. You could look back, all of the landmark legislation, and I might be preaching to the choir here, but all of the landmark legislation that advances the rights of any of those groups has come under Democratic administrations. And so I hope so. I hope so. We'll see. I hope that we can begin with a cabinet that does resemble the Democratic Party's constituency and doesn't cater to Republican interests just for the sake of getting it confirmed. We'll have to see.
I really hope Biden elects Bernie for the state of labor, for the cabinet of labor.
Yeah,
That'd be very great.
Me too. But I worry about those kinds of nominations.
Yeah, definitely. It's very worrying because Biden is a very centrist, and he worked with Republicans, and Republicans know, and we know that as Republicans, they don't actually care about the working class.
Yeah. No, I'm
That's
right
kind
there.
of worrying. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to see. See.
Hopefully. Let's see. Hope for the best.
One place where I think we are going to have a resounding victory is in foreign policy.
Yeah.
See, this is where I think Joe Biden doesn't necessarily have to lean to Republican interests when he makes this nomination for UN ambassador, etc. We're going to be certainly he's not going to choose Nikki Haley for the UN ambassador. So I mean, we've alienated a lot of our trade partners and NATO, and I think that it will generally be a good trend for the world in general, since America is kind of the center of the world still.
Yeah, Quinn, and to your point, there are a lot of decisions that Biden can make without the consent of the Republican Senate. That's just all there is. Like reinserting the United States in the Paris deal, reinstating the Iran nuclear deal, making decisions about foreign policy. And moreover, even if Biden has to kind of soften a little bit with some of his cabinet nominations, I'm pretty sure we're not going to get Betsy DeVos as the education secretary, right? Pardon me if any of you came from private schools, but Betsy DeVos never visited a public school in like her entire tenure as education secretary. She was installed essentially to serve the interests of private education and dismantle public education. I'm almost positive that even if Biden has to choose someone moderate or vanilla, that it's not going to be anyone like that. And so, I think that there's sort of a middle ground here that could be acceptable, right, to those of us who might want to see someone more centrist or left leaning in that kind of a position. And really, honestly, like, I can think of right leaning education secretaries who wouldn't want to destroy public education. And so it really isn't even like an ideological thing. It's like wanting to have public services thing, right? Listen, everyone, if you want to take the mic and make a comment, please feel free to do so. I'm going to begin to read some of these comments in the chat, but you can just interrupt me whenever you want. And I'm happy to give you the floor, but I want to incorporate some of these comments. Maricela says, I'm just worried of all the bad things the Trump administration will do the rest of their term. While we were all worried about the elections, Trump secretly froze the wages for immigrant farm workers. If he did that when he predicted he will lose, I wonder what's ahead of us. I know, Maricela, I've been thinking about that too. He's in power for another couple months, and he's already lined his pockets and the pockets of his family members. The corruption has already been staggering. What's going to happen now? We've already seen him, as you point out, freeze the wages of farm workers. He did so very quietly, but he's got nothing to lose now. He's a lame duck, and he's angry, and he's very likely to do more of this. And I'm concerned about it too. Quinn says the only thing I'm worried about is faithless electors. Yeah, me too. What do you say we get rid of the Electoral College and just have a direct vote? Alondra says, I think the overall election results, yeah, amen, yeah, was relieving because it was an anxiety-filled week. I definitely agree with Quinn that the lawsuits will not necessarily change much. What is scary is how Trump and his supporters will retaliate now and after everything because people are upset and many have threatened violence on others. Quinn says, but it would take a lot of convincing on the parts of Trump's team to sway over 20 electors to take the victory away from Joe. Touche. A more distant possibility is that Republican legislatures in some states that went blue will appoint new electors loyal to Trump who will override the decisions of voters and give the Electoral College votes for those states to Trump. But, for example, the Pennsylvania legislature has already said that will not happen. And so that's positive. But it still is possible legally and technically for this election to go to Trump. And that's what the Electoral College creates as a possibility. And so it's a little bit unnerving for us to go out and vote in such huge numbers and then for the possibility that the election will swing to become real. Abel says, sorry, Professor, I had internet problems. No worries. We heard you well, Abel. And 80, just come with us when you have your internet and it's functioning, no worries. Ishan says, Quinn, there was a Supreme Court ruling on faithless electors that the state can compel the electors to do whatever the state wants them to do. Yeah, exactly. And this is my point about, and so that's actually a separate point, right? The state the state legislature can compel the electors to do whatever the state wants them to do. The legislatures can also appoint new electors. And so those are actually separate scenarios, but this is what becomes possible with the Electoral College. And I think, Quinn, technically electors can change their minds. They can, and sometimes they do. There are usually some defectors. Ishan shares a link for those of you who want to check that out. Delianor chimes in and says, yes, I agree, Biden may be able to bring the nation together, but the next 72 days Trump has left can be very detrimental to the days ahead. We cannot relax until Trump is shipped home and confined to his house for a season. Even better, the IRS can have him. Yeah, no kidding. I'm actually looking forward to him maybe being indicted along with the rest of his henchmen and his family members. And it could be interesting too to see the Secret Service or the military escort him out of the building on January 20th. Something tells me he won't go voluntarily, and that would be fun to see. Christian says, thank whatever higher entity you believe in that she will be gone. Yeah, absolutely. Here we are at a very fine public institution. The University of California is a public Ivy. And so those of us here know well that public schools and public education matter a great deal. And so we value that, and we don't make any apology for that.
I just want to touch bases on the public schooling
Yeah.
idea. I think it's I think it's kind of sad how it like it has turned into like a political ideology like during Trump's administration about like only like wanting private schools and kind of dismantling public schools. I feel like as a like country, like I think we need to have a priority straight, and I think they don't have it when it comes to public education. I think they kind of seek private education as something better than public, and I feel like that's kind of just sad that we don't have our heads right when it comes to like education here in the United States,
Yeah, no,
and
I
like
agree.
wanting more private schools and stuff like that.
I agree with you, Clarissa. Last year, I was a visiting professor at Skidmore College in upstate New York, and it's this elite private liberal arts college. It's considered one of the hidden Ivies. But I'm telling you this because of my experience there, and I experienced what it's like to be in one of those bubbles. Skidmore was able to get a huge handout during the COVID relief program, money that was meant for small and other businesses, and it wasn't supposed to go to these kinds of private entities, especially private schools. And it kind of reflects more generally the fact that, like Clarissa said, there's been this kind of dismissal of public education. And under the Trump administration, private education was really valued above public education. And really, more than just that, what we witnessed is a lot of rent seeking on the part of private educational institutions. These institutions seeking to get access to funds without any intention of generating new value. And it's not enough for private institutions to just self-provide and not rely on public money. They apparently also have to seek that public money and take it away from public schools or from other institutions that are more deserving of it. And so this has been my experience. And I'm going to tell you straight up that I've had a better experience at public schools. And I've gone to public schools my whole life. I've worked in private institutions in 2 countries. The situations are very different, but I agree with Clarissa that under the Trump administration, private schools really got a leg up over public schools, and it became an ideological and a political thing, when in reality, public schools need to be a bedrock of the whole system because it's a service that is essential. Quinn says, I really hate Betsy DeVos, to be honest. Same, as does Jessica. Quinn says, I call her the female antichrist to my friends and family. Pretty much, right? Samantha says, no more Ben Carson. Also, it's sad he has COVID. Yeah, goodbye, Ben Carson. Ishan says, killing it in the administration as the education secretary and on the basketball court. Sarah says, this past week has seriously brought out the white savior complex in a lot of white liberals, and I wonder what the repercussions of that will be on the Democratic Party during Biden's presidency. Because I've noticed so many white leftists speaking over people of color or white-splaining what oppression is to people of color lately under the guise of advocacy and progressiveness, and it's very disheartening and counterintuitive. There's such a fine line between white saviorism versus using your privileged platform, and so many people don't know the difference. That's why, like someone mentioned earlier, it's so important that those members of these marginalized groups have won their spots on the table. I hope Biden's presidency doesn't divide the Democratic Party or overshadow the systematic struggles we are trying to overcome. I agree, Sarah, and I'm going to add to that the Democratic Party has dove headlong into sort of identity politics issues, and they've done so in a way that's kind of superficial. And the problem with that, obviously, is that it's easy to just say stuff, much harder to actually act and really improve the lives of those groups. It's easier to just take credit and try to talk about it without actually doing it. And one of the problems with the Democratic Party is that they just don't often vouch as much for these communities as they should. And they haven't done enough to correct those injustices. And of course, the saviorism really is a slap in the face because it's that superficiality. And I agree with you. And I think that at the very least, though, it's a positive thing that the composition of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives is beginning to evolve. Maybe the party will change along with that evolution. We'll have to wait and see. Alejandro
I
said,
wanted to
please.
comment on that. This comment, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think what kind of pisses me off personally is when the early data of voting and who voted for who, we see that a lot of first things first is Trump had more votes this time around than he did in 2016. That, if I'm not mistaken, I saw something like that. I don't know if that's 100% accurate, but
Yeah.
and the data is also saying that white groups, white males and white females, hunkered down on Trump as well, and that the main reasons he lost was because of a lot of minority groups across the country coming together and voting, and a lot of grassroots organizations. You know, you see headlines about Stacey Abrams. You might have seen headlines about the Navajo tribe voting in New Mexico and in Arizona. And it wasn't white saviorism that got this election. It did not get Biden into the president's seat. It was a lot of other people who did that work. And so it's just, it's in my mind, and also like I know people like on TikTok have seen those videos or on Twitter of exactly what Sarah was talking about. And it's just like, okay, thank you for using your platform, but also please don't overstep is the big issue.
I want to add something to that, Christian. That's such a good point about who really won the election for them. One of the best things about the election for me was that Georgia went to Biden because of, wait for it, voters in the district of former Representative John Lewis, the Black representative who was a civil rights icon and who recently passed away, and who Trump spit on after he passed away, and who Trump always disrespected. And so for John Lewis's district, which is heavily Black, to vote in huge numbers and to swing Georgia to Biden's side is just so good. It couldn't be any better. I love that. And this is an example of what Christian's talking about, which is that, look, this election was won because of minority communities voting in larger numbers and coming together and forming coalitions in these places and going and voting in large numbers. It wasn't because of whites. Whites overwhelmingly voted again in favor of Trump. Now, if you look at this and how it breaks down in terms of education, you'll see that there are pretty big differences in terms of different education levels. Not all white people are the same. Some hate Trump and some love Trump. But the point is, minorities won this election for Biden. And that means that the Democratic Party needs to really represent them effectively. And they haven't done so until now. Hopefully they can begin doing so now. I don't know if they've yet to begin doing so. I won't say until now. We'll have to wait and see. Alejandra says, definitely a sigh of relief, but this election was kind of picking between the lesser of two evils. Biden is not the ideal candidate, and it's sad we simply have to settle for him, but at least he's sympathetic and attempts to unite and accommodate all Americans instead of further initiating hate and dividing the nation. I think what is scary is how many people comfortably expressed their racism and showed their support towards such a sexist, transphobic, Islamophobic misogynist. I agree. Figure during Trump's presidency goes to show that racism is prevalent, and although we have made major strides towards equality since the 1960s, it is still a work in progress. But most importantly, there is a big win for women, especially African-American women. I'm sure Rosa Parks would be so extremely proud of the outcome of this election. Agreed, and I think Rosa Parks would be thrilled about what happened in John Lewis's district, among others. Carmina went to a protest on Friday and a Trump supporter drove by and pointed a gun at everyone. Just goes to show how dangerous these privileged white racist people are. They're mad they lost and jeopardizing the safety of others. I agree. Juan says, honestly, Trump is so unpredictable. I feel that Biden will fix what Trump broke in many ways. Juan says, I went to private school and honestly, I think that they have enough money because they charge like $18,000 and it's honestly saddening that they took from school funding for public schools and basically took from the poor. I agree. Quinn, if the Democratic Party becomes more divided, I think it might finally be a prime opportunity for the Green Party to become a more serious contender in American politics. AOC and the squad could become the leadership it needs and give it the momentum it also needs to bring it to the national stage. Juan says, I just saw a video of this woman who committed voter fraud and she was a Trump supporter, no lie. Alejandra says, AOC is a queen. Yes, indeed, she is. I agree. I love AOC. I think AOC and the squad are probably more aligned with the Green Party than the current centrism of the Democratic Party. Probably Quinn. And it's a good example of how really progressive politicians have to usually run with a major party if they want to win in this electoral system. The Democratic Party continue to be a liberal party that only do public stunts for liberals to like while not working on the issues Americans care about. Christian says, that's hardcore. I gave my full respect to that man in his district. Same. I love John Lewis, and he was always such a warrior. And it's just so good that that was the district that swung it in Georgia. It's just amazing. Quinn says we can also thank Queen Stacey Abrams. Indeed, Stacey Abrams is the best, and all her people. Okay, so this is great. Let's go ahead and get started with what we have for today. As always, we have such a robust discussion, and we can now take some of our energy and begin to put it in the issues that we're discussing right now. And that issue is corruption. Now this,
Sorry, can I say one quick thing?
yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
sorry. It's very partisan. I'm sorry, but if you are interested in the Georgia elections, you can go to the websites I'm going to type in the chat and volunteer your time to them. Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome, Quinn. Thank you. Hey, everyone, if you know people in Georgia who are turning 18 before the runoff election, tell them to vote. Seriously, because that runoff election will be very important. Those races could tilt the balance of power in the Senate, and everything we just talked about could be annulled if that balance of power changes. And so I encourage you to get involved if you can. This race is not over. Okay, so let's recenter and get back to this issue of corruption. What's so interesting about corruption? Well, it's all about those smoky rooms that you see in movies that you think might exist in real life, but you're just not sure. Truth is, we're not always sure because we don't know all of the corruption that takes place, but the corruption scandals that do take place and that become sufficiently big and that we discover, we know a lot about. And we're going to talk about the first one that will come to mind when we talk about Latin America, and that is Operation Car Wash. And this is this gigantic scandal that began years and years and years ago. And basically what it involves is Brazilian presidents and a whole bunch of other types of political officials accepting bribes in return for awarding contracts to construction firms at inflated prices. And so these construction companies would pay bribes to these political leaders and these public officials, and then these officials would award them contracts at above market rates so that these firms would get a huge payout. This is a classic bribery scheme. This is a classic type of corruption scandal. And the individuals and the entities involved in this scandal are myriad. It includes the state oil firm Petrobras, politicians and presidents of the chamber and the Senate, state governors, top businessmen. And over the years, more than 1,000 top public officials have been issued warrants of a variety of different types. This might be the biggest corruption scandal in history, anywhere. It's certainly the biggest corruption scandal in Latin American history and the biggest scandal in Brazil. And Operation Car Wash gives you an insight into these smoky rooms and these deals that get made and why they get made the way they do. Now, Brazil is a country that has long had a problem with corruption. And so for many, Operation Car Wash does not come as a surprise. But one thing that has come as a surprise is how much of a consequence it has had politically. There have been impeachments, there have been political crises, there have been polarization, all sorts of results that have come from this. And to some degree, where Brazil is today is a reflection of the dissatisfaction with democratic governments that Brazilians feel. The current administration is an administration, a populist administration that has discredited democratic institutions, that has promised to end corruption. And Brazil is in a worse position because of this scandal. Now, Operation Car Wash is one example of corruption in Latin America, and we'll go over other examples. This is a video that I had in mind. It's not 8:09. It's 10 after. I think that we should go ahead and watch this. Actually, you know what? We'll come back to it, okay? We'll come back to it. I think it's more important for us to get through this lecture and then maybe watch the video if we have time.
I have a quick question.
Yes, Clarissa.
Would you say that this corruption that is happening in Brazil has any collateral damage with like the human rights in Brazil?
That's an interesting question. Um, I can't think of like a direct link. Corruption usually impacts the economy and it contributes to it drains resources, and it reduces investment. It contributes to a slowing of economic growth. It wastes time and talent. It's possible that human rights could be affected if, for example, there are like officials in the military or the police involved, and if they somehow are excused for abuses that are somehow related to maybe a kickback or some kind of a scheme related to Operation Car Wash. I don't know if there are any of those direct links. We'll talk later in the discussion about how corruption affects the economy and how it affects economic performance in governance more generally. So Operation Car Wash is an example of grand corruption. Remember that we distinguish between grand corruption and petty corruption. Petty corruption is the kind that you might be more familiar with as an individual. And petty corruption involves all sorts of things that might happen in daily life in your interactions with public officials or political leaders. And so, for example, maybe if you're a citizen in a Latin American country, maybe you bribed a bureaucrat to speed up a public service. Maybe you needed to get a driver's license more quickly, or you wanted to get your power turned back on more quickly. Maybe you get stopped by the police at a checkpoint and the police demand that you pay a bribe or that you pay them something in order to be able to move on. Or maybe they say that they'll give you a speeding ticket unless you pay them. Maybe you've used personal connections for private gain. Maybe, acceptance to a university or some sort of business deal that came from a personal connection and it could be considered corrupt. Maybe there's corruption in education that relates to kickbacks or transfers of money from the federal government to other districts. Maybe there's corruption in the health sector in a similar way. These are all examples of petty corruption. And notice that the difference is that these are all small scale, right? These are things that like ordinary people might experience. And in all likelihood, a lot of Latin Americans, and in many countries, a majority of them have experienced this kind of corruption. And it's corruption that is often more socially acceptable. And I'll show you in a minute that in a place like Brazil, it's actually part of the norm. It's a convention in some respects to engage in petty corruption to get things done. And so petty corruption is very, very different than grand corruption, and not just in its scope and its magnitude and in its consequences, but also in terms of how common it is and whether it's socially acceptable or not. And so I want to be relatively blunt and just ask you, because I know that many of us have experience in Latin America, including myself. And I want to ask you, has a public official in a Latin American country ever asked you or someone to pay them? Have you ever paid the police? Have you ever bribed a public official to speed up public services? Any of these things we very likely have experienced or done ourselves, and that's not necessarily bad. But I want to know if you have, and what was that like? Is there anyone who's experienced something like this who wants to comment on it?
I have no personal experience with it, but I have heard stories from my parents about how their parents or my grandparents have bribed police officers in Mexico before for various reasons, just to make things go faster or just avoid trouble.
For sure. Yeah. And I'll show you in a minute that as many as half of all Mexicans have experienced this from year to year. And so it's extremely common. And Quinn actually adds, my boyfriend had to pay a bribe to a police officer in Mexico last year for speeding, like $20, I think. Yeah, that's super common. That's super common. And in Mexico as well as in other Latin American countries, but Mexico especially, and Venezuela seem to have the highest rates of corruption. Now, I personally have never paid a bribe or paid a public official, but I was a victim of basically a theft in a money exchange house in Buenos Aires. And I'm almost positive that the security guard was working with the people behind the counter. They undercounted the money that I gave them and then gave me the exchange for the total that they said I gave them. And I tried to like say something, and the security guard basically like made it known that I couldn't do anything. I'm pretty sure that they were going to split the treasure once I left. But my point is that this kind of dealing is very common in Latin America. And to some degree, it's cultural in the sense that it's kind of embedded. It's socially acceptable to some degree. It's part of daily life. You might pay a bribe. You might have to pay a policeman or a policewoman. Maybe you get taken advantage of in some way. This is actually quite common. And in Latin America, like other countries in developing regions, does have an issue with corruption. Samantha says, in Honduras, there's the Hurricane ETA going through. The National Guard is going to rich towns and picking up people with money before the poor. Gladly, my family is okay, but I know it's horrible right now. Alejandra says, my taxi just outside the airport was stopped for speeding, and we just gave them 500 pesos. Quinn says, you were the taxi driver. Marcella says, it's common in Latin America that when they migrate to the United States and this happens to them, they view it as normal. Yes, and that's one problem, Maricela. They don't know that it's not normal in the U.S. and they get taken advantage of for that reason. But in a place like Brazil, it's especially normal. And there's actually a phrase, o jeitinho brasileiro. It's a term that relates to finding a way to get something done by bypassing rules. The word jeitinho means finding a way to get something done or accomplish something by bypassing normal conventions or normal rules. And that word comes from dar jeito, which literally means find a way. And it doesn't have a bad connotation. In fact, you'll see here an image that circulated in Brazil. It talks about creative solutions since 1500. And in that phrase, jeitinho brasileiro, I don't speak Portuguese, sorry. I had to look this up to be able to say it. But this is the norm in Brazil. And if you go to Brazil, this will be something that you experience most likely. Many people, large pluralities of people, experience this in their dealings with the police or public servants or public officials. And generally speaking, it's not viewed negatively, it's viewed positively. But this, again, is petty corruption. It's different from that grand corruption that we talked about. And so it doesn't have the same set of consequences that, say, huge bribery scandals and huge corruption scandals have when they involve construction firms and presidents and governments, et cetera. And so in everyday life, corruption prevails in places like Brazil and in Mexico, to some degree, Argentina. This is kind of the way things work. And when you go there, it can often be surprising if you're not aware of it and if you're not expecting it. Orlando says, my uncle got stopped, but since he did not have any money on him, though since he owns a bakery, he gave them 10 empanadas de tuna and they left us alone. Tuna empanadas, they left us alone. Quinn says, don't tell me you had to pay the fine when it was the taxi driver's fault. Yeah. So we've all experienced this to some degree, or at least we know people who've experienced it. And in some ways, we've seen for ourselves how common it is and how it is a factor of life. And so in Brazil, o jeitinho brasileiro, it is reflected in, say, you're dealing with the police. If you were to get a ticket, you might pay them. Now, maybe you take advantage of existing electrical lines and you try to steal your electricity. Maybe you buy a pirated DVD or some music. Maybe you drink and drive and you pay off the police so you don't get caught. Maybe you steal your cable. All of these are examples of corruption in everyday life, and that are types of corruption that are viewed as socially acceptable. And especially if you are a poor person. In Brazil, as in Mexico and Chile and other countries, there's extreme inequality. And so that means that huge sectors of society rely on this form of corruption to accomplish things that they couldn't otherwise accomplish. And so if you have to get a driver's license, well, it might take a long time. Maybe you just bribe a public official to be able to get it more quickly. You know, maybe you get a speeding ticket and you can't afford the ticket. Maybe you just bribe the public official or the cop, however much you have to bribe them, so long as it's less than what you'll have to pay for the ticket itself, and so on and so forth. Now, the thing about corruption is that it's really difficult to measure. We don't really have, Samantha asks, would you say that corruption helps with the high rates of femicide in Latin America? Um, as with the question about human rights, I don't really know how corruption affects the high rates of femicide. I'm sure that it does, especially because corruption usually means that public services suffer badly. Public services are essential to women who need reproductive services, or women who might be in terrible situations because of spousal abuse, or who face any number of challenges that they face because of their women. Without the public services that they might need to rely on, like the police, or a functioning system of accountability institutions like courts, because those suffer from corruption, femicide rates are probably much higher. So to answer your question, Samantha, I think that corruption certainly makes femicide worse. So the thing about corruption is it's really hard to study. Like, how do we observe and study something when the participants do everything in their power to conceal it? Even the person who pays a police officer to get out of a ticket won't tell anyone that they paid that police officer. It's very likely that some of you feel uncomfortable with me even asking you if you've ever done this. And I understand that. But this is part of the reason why it's so hard to study this systematically. Now, we do have a number of corruption indices that are designed to measure it and give us a sense of how much of it there actually is. But even these are based on assessments by experts and really their perception of the degree of corruption. And that might be based on individual experience, but it never is based on some kind of sort of data set, right, of all the corrupt acts that took place. Instead, it is based on one's understanding of the level of corruption in a place. And so it's always imperfect. A better way of often measuring corruption is to ask citizens directly, anonymously in surveys, and to ask them, have you experienced corruption? Have you paid a police officer? Have you been bribed by a public official? What is your experience with this in the last year? And so in Latin America, the 2019 Perceptions Index shows the countries of the region as relatively corrupt. You compare Latin America to, say, Africa, South and East Asia, and you notice that Latin America is a little bit less corrupt than Africa on the whole. It might be a little bit more corrupt than South, East, and East Asia. Generally speaking, it's going to be among the more corrupt places in the developing world, with the exception of maybe Africa. These countries continue to grapple with this issue. What's different about Latin America than Africa is that the democracies and the political systems in these countries are much older. We already know that Latin American countries trace their independence to more than 200 years ago, whereas many African countries have only been independent democracies, if they even are democracies, for fewer than 60 years. And so Latin America has a persistent issue with corruption, and how we grapple with that deals with and has to do with types of reforms and institutions that are put in place to mitigate and overcome the problem. And to date, in places like Argentina, those solutions have been inadequate for the most part. And so we'll talk about that momentarily. But what I want you to notice before we continue is the variation, both within the region and across regions within the developing world. So in a country like Uruguay, there's a very low level of corruption. But in a country like Brazil, a country like Venezuela, the corruption rates are much higher. In Mexico, corruption is relatively high. In a country like Australia, relatively low, a little bit higher in the United States, interestingly. In Russia, it's pretty high. But in African countries, much higher in some cases. But generally speaking, Latin America is probably most comparable to Africa in terms of just how corrupt many of these places are, according to this index. Let's take a look at bribery rates by country. So this is also from the Transparency International Perceptions Index. This goes to show this shows us the different bribery rates in Latin American countries. And so we have every country that shares a colonial legacy with Spain or Portugal. And we also have a number of countries in the Caribbean. Some of these don't have data, but the question here is, did you pay a bribe to get a public service in the previous 12 months? And in some countries like Mexico, it's as high as 34%. So 34% of people who responded to the survey paid a bribe to get a public service in the last year. In a country like Chile, it's 13%. In a country like Peru, it's 30%. In a country like Venezuela, it's 50%. 50% appears to be the highest. Colombia, it's 20%. Guatemala, it's 25%. Honduras, it's 28%. These are relatively high percentages. Look at that. In Venezuela, 50% of people in a space of 12 months have to pay a bribe to get a public service, like a license or a utility or whatever it is that they need. That's an incredibly high number. And these are just the people who responded to the survey. It could be a higher number if people felt at all concerned about disclosing that in a survey, which is often the case when it's something this sensitive. So this data is interesting because it goes to show that there's a lot of variation, but that generally speaking, the corruption rates are pretty high when it comes to bribery in public services. Police is another area where citizens often experience corruption in Latin America. When you're in Latin America and you encounter the police, there's always the possibility that they'll ask you to pay a bribe. They'll ask you to pay them to get out of a ticket or to avoid some hardship that they could impose on you by virtue of their public authority. And so in Venezuela, 62% of people paid a bribe to the police in the last year. In Mexico, it's 52%. Dominican Republic, it's 47%. On the low end, countries like Chile, Costa Rica, and Barbados have much lower percentages. And so in those countries, the police appear to be more professionalized. At the very least, citizens don't appear to be paying high bribes the way that they are in Venezuela, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. Police is really important because obviously the police function to guarantee and ensure public security. And if citizens cannot get security without paying the police, that's a real problem, because it means then that the police are exploiting citizens and are potentially leaving them in harm's way if they don't, turn over the money. And so, especially when you consider that in a place like Mexico, ensuring security is especially important because of criminal gangs and drug violence. When you consider that, it becomes especially troubling that you have to pay them to get what you need, or to avoid them abusing their power in some way. Now, another way we can look at this is we can look at the percentage of citizens who are offered bribes in exchange for votes. So in this situation, it works the other way. This is where political parties and candidates offer to pay citizens in exchange for their votes. Now, this is the most common in Mexico because the Institutional Revolution Party used this tactic and has used this tactic for almost 100 years to guarantee their reelection, or to at least hope to guarantee their reelection. They will often, go to poor communities and give them money, give them food, in exchange for their vote. And the party then monitors the behavior of the voter to make sure that they vote in favor of the party. But it's also a problem in the Dominican Republic, where 46% of people have done this. In Brazil, 40% of people have accepted a bribe in exchange for their vote, or have been offered a bribe in exchange for their vote. In Colombia, it's 40%. In Honduras, it's 36%. Guatemala is 27%. Peru, it's 27%. Now, who are these people being offered these bribes? Well, they're overwhelmingly poor people, people who need the chicken, who need the rice, who need the drugs, who need the money, who need the beer. And I say drugs because it's true. In Mexico and elsewhere, one of the things that they give them is drugs to get their vote. And so they'll give them some marijuana or some cocaine or something. And the whole point is, get them on a string so that you can ensure their support. You'll continue paying them for their vote in future elections, but you want to guarantee their support. This is a form of corruption, this vote buying. I was really surprised to see that in Chile, the rate is as high as 20%. That's very surprising to me. But then again, there's very high inequality in Chile. And if you if you've ever been to Santiago, you know that there's a radical difference between the upper class and the lower class in that metro area. So this is the vote buying rate across different countries. And again, we see a lot of variation, but that staggering 50% in Mexico just really speaks volumes. Half of people in Mexico in this survey were offered a bribe in exchange for their vote. That's incredible. That means like 1 in every 2 people, half of the society, the voting age electorate, were offered money in exchange for their vote. Now, here's another piece of interesting survey data from a Latin American politics and perceptions survey conducted in 2010. And what you see is, taking into account your own experience or what you have heard, seen, etc., as much as 43% of respondents said it was very, very common to experience corruption, either in public services or with the police or in any area of society. That's compared to 37% who said it was common. And together, only about 20% said it was uncommon or very uncommon. So that means 80% of all Latin Americans said that it's very common or common to experience corruption in public life. Now, narrowing down and looking at just relations with police officers, we find that 90% report that in the last 12 months, a police officer had not asked them for a bribe. 9% had. Now, I think if you looked at this by country, you'd see similar data to what we just saw, where in Mexico, it's as high as 20 or 30%. But generally speaking, across the region, it's only about 9%. Now, only about 9%, that's still pretty high. Gives you a sense of how high the percentage is, even taking into consideration all those countries that are relatively low in that area that we saw in previous slides. This is interesting data because, again, it gives us an insight into the experience of ordinary people in what they go through in Latin America when they try to get a public service or deal with the police or whatever. Now, at this stage, you might be asking, what causes corruption and how can we get a handle on this if it's such a challenge or such a problem? Well, we don't know a lot about it, to be honest with you. I did talk last class about my own research. I don't study corruption, but I have devoted my academic career to studying the reform of institutions that contribute to corruption. One of those is export taxes that provide the military with off-budget revenue, usually from natural resources. What we know about corruption is that it's often caused, first and foremost, by a lack of mechanisms to monitor the behavior of politicians and public officials. And so what we really mean is an absence of anti-corruption bodies. These are institutions that are set up as independent entities tasked with reducing corruption, auditing the public sector, introducing policies to prevent corruption. But these are generally relatively weak. Even in a country like Argentina, where they created one in 2000, it's been relatively ineffective. And so part of the story has to do with the failure of institution building in these countries. In many countries, they don't even have these anti-corruption bodies at all, let alone ones that are simply just too weak. The second cause is the presence of natural resources. Now, what do we know about Latin America? It has a lot of natural resources. It has a lot of copper, it has gold, it has lithium, it has wood, it has everything, right? Natural resources remain the key export in most of these countries despite industrialization. Chile, for example, gets half of its government revenue from copper. But what does this mean for corruption? Well, it means that there's a lot of what we call lootable wealth. There's a lot of money sloshing around in the state from these public investments in natural resources. And I'll give you an example in a moment that shows you this. But whenever you have all this lootable wealth just kind of sloshing around, it always creates an incentive for political actors to take it and to steal it and to engage in corruption to benefit privately from that public resource. And so in countries with less or fewer natural resources and fewer revenue streams coming into the state from those natural resources, lower rates of corruption are observed. And then finally, and importantly, scarce public benefits and low wages. Why do the police bribe people who they can give tickets to? Well, it's because they're not getting paid enough. Oftentimes, they don't get paid. Their wages are poor. They're not compensated well. their public benefits are meager, and so they bridge the gap by taking advantage of people. Now they probably often overdo it, and I'm sure that there are a lot of cops out there in Latin America who have low wages but who do just fine because of all the bribes that they collect. But the point is that if you don't pay them well and give them an incentive to behave well, or a reason to not be corrupt, they will be corrupt. And this is another reason that we see connected to corruption. So let's go over some examples to think about some of these different causes. So we'll look at an example of an inefficient mechanism for monitoring behavior. This is Argentina's Oficina Anticorrupción. This is an anti-corruption body that was designed to audit the public sector, introduce policies to prevent corruption, and just kind of basically clean things up, especially after the 90s when the privatization process involved a lot of kickbacks and a lot of bribery. This is a decentralized agency. It reports to the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights, which might be interesting to those of you who wonder about the connection to human rights. It was created in 1999 by the De La Rua administration after the 90s in that privatization process contributed to so much corruption. But the main problem with this agency is that it has a lot of coordination problems and it's relatively weak. It doesn't have a great budget. The decentralized nature of it means that it requires the coordination of a variety of different offices, but that coordination often breaks down. They sometimes duplicate efforts. They don't do well auditing the public sector. And generally speaking, corruption has not fallen in Argentina. It remains relatively high. It might not be at the levels that it was in the 90s, but it's not clear that any success or reduction is due to this office. To be honest with you, it's not a hugely important player. It's one that is relatively weak and relatively inefficient as far as mechanisms for monitoring behavior are concerned. This is a photo of the office in Jujuy, the Oficina Anticorrupción. They have a number of these offices in the different provinces, and they're all in charge of auditing the public sector and expenses and finances in those different regions. This is the organization chart for the Ministry of Human Rights and Justice in Argentina. And you see here the Oficina Anticorrupción. And within it are two subsecretariats for integrity and transparency and anti-corruption investigations. These are the different divisions of this bureaucracy. This bureaucracy was set up to audit the public sector and to reduce corruption. But as I said, it's not clear that it's been successful in doing so. And part of the story of its lack of success has to do with the strength, the continuing strength of a lot of the social actors in Argentina and the relative weakness of the state. In Argentina, historically, the state and state institutions have been relatively weak, while different social groups like unions, the private sector have been relatively strong. And what that has meant is that they often are able to resist policies that might undercut some of the benefits enjoyed by some of those actors. This is another example of that. We'll take a look at the role of the presence of natural resources. Now, I talked before about the case of Military Gate in Chile. The reason I like this example so much is because it shows you that even in a country with relatively low levels of corruption, the presence of natural resources and lootable wealth can create a lot of opportunities, even so. And so in this case, this was an instance of fraud in the diversions of funds from a sovereign wealth fund that was set up to collect streams of revenue generated by an export tax imposed on copper exports. It's a tax of 10%. The Codelco State Copper Company, which is the biggest copper company in the world, Chile produces 5 times more copper than anyone else in the world, has to give 10% of its export revenue to the military. And this revenue stream and the resulting sovereign wealth fund are both off budget, which means that neither the legislature or any institution of the state can monitor or even know how much money is being turned over. And unsurprisingly, officers helped themselves to this source of lootable wealth. They saw all this money sloshing around and they set up a scheme where they would basically contract for services from a military firm called FAME, and then the services would never take place and they would just run off with the money. And invoices were issued for those non-rendered services. The way this would work is military officers were in charge of FAME And then other military officers would work with those military officers in charge of the company to set up these fake transactions. And then they would all just kind of run off with the money after the fact. And this was uncovered by a journalist whose name is Mauricio Weibel, who I was supposed to meet with when I was in Chile, but I didn't get the opportunity to. I've written a paper about the reform of the copper law in Chile. I compare Chile to Ecuador. What I found is that corruption is both a consequence of some of these export tax arrangements and also sometimes a cause of the reform, because corruption can be so damaging that it can tilt the balance of power politically, and it can make parties who are searching for electoral support cater to citizens and voters who want to reduce corruption. And so it's interesting to see that even in a country like Chile, the presence of lootable wealth makes it possible to engage in large-scale grand corruption. Now, there are a number of consequences of corruption. It's not without a toll. It exacts a terrible toll. And so far, what you've probably picked up on is the impact on economic development, the waste of resources, the sidelining of huge sums of money, and the transfer of public money to private hands under dubious circumstances, smoky rooms, all this stuff. More precisely, we can say that corruption creates uncertainty, it discourages investments, it taxes entrepreneurship, it decreases tax revenue, it diverts talent into rent seeking and wasting money, it lowers the quality of public infrastructure, it distorts the composition of public expenditure. In general, it distorts the economy and it creates waste, it creates uncertainty, it discourages investment, it taxes creativity, and it wastes talent. Generally speaking, it's a drag on the economy and it delays development. And this is why institutional reforms are so critically important in a place like Chile or Venezuela or Ecuador or Mexico or Argentina. Economic development has often been linked to the quality of institutions. And those institutions where corruption exists need to be created so as to work against corruption. And in many Latin American countries, that hasn't been done yet. And so one way of looking at this is to think about, this funny cartoon where there's plenty of corruption to go around, there's plenty of bribery to go around, there's plenty of commissioning of certain works and handouts and kickbacks to go around, but the treasury itself is empty. And the reason is because it's been emptied out and its contents have been handed over to actors who enter into these corrupt relationships. In the case of Operation Car Wash, it's private construction firms. In the case of Chile, it's the military, FAME, the military company, and military officers. In cases of Peru and Ecuador, it's the allies of the ruling Fujimori administration, or the allies of the military, or the military itself in Ecuador, and so on and so forth. And so we see then what this looks like when depicted humorously, but it's not humorous. And we know it's not humorous because of the effect that it has on the economy. And the effect that it has on poor people is especially damning. And this takes us back to Samantha's question about the impact of corruption on femicide. We know that in Latin America, poor women and indigenous women are disproportionately likely to be abused or murdered because they are women. And corruption factors in because the burden of corruption falls disproportionately on poor people. And so when you divert public resources from infrastructure investments like health clinics and schools to capital intensive ones like defense contracts, those women in need of protection or support and those poor people in general in need of the above don't get it. Instead, that money is siphoned off and essentially handed over to actors who already have sufficient resources. It's a waste. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of resources. It's a missed opportunity, and it's a failed investment to the extent that it leaves those women, especially in poor people in general, without the support and the services that they need. Corruption disproportionately affects them in this way. Service delivery is also negatively affected by corruption. So For instance, if you need utilities, if you need power, or if you need plumbing, it's very likely, or it's likely, depending upon where you are, that the delivery of that service might be slowed or affected by corruption because of the fact that all those bureaucrats have to be bribed, everyone within that chain has to be paid off before you can finally get the delivery of that service that you so direly need. All of that delay affects ordinary people, and it disproportionately affects poor people who cannot self-provide, who have to rely on those public services in order to get by. And I'm going to leave you with one quote. This is a quote by Ban Ki-moon, who had the following to say about corruption. If he says this about corruption in general, imagine how applicable it is to Latin America. He said the following: when public money is stolen for private gain, it means fewer resources to build schools, hospitals, roads, and water treatment facilities. When foreign aid is diverted into private bank accounts, major infrastructure projects come to a halt. Corruption enables fake or substandard medicines to be dumped on the market and hazardous waste to be dumped in landfills and in oceans. The vulnerable suffer first and suffer worst. If this is true in general, it's absolutely true in the case of Latin America. Listen, everybody, we're out of time, unfortunately, as always, but I thank you so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday. We'll finish up this lecture. We've got just a few slides left, and then we'll deal with a new set of issues as we continue to talk about challenges facing Latin American countries. So thanks so much.
Wednesday a holiday?
Yeah, Wednesday's Veterans Day.
We don't have class on Wednesday?
My other professor said no class Wednesday.
Same.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, it's
Well,
just Veterans Day.
this is the second time this has happened. It's so embarrassing. Well, I guess I'll see you on Monday then, and I hope that you enjoy Veterans Day. Sorry for the confusion. Quinn asks, maybe you can record lecture. Well, if it's a day off, I probably won't do that because it's intended to be a day off. But we'll get back together. Sorry, everybody. I think one of the things that happens when we're not on campus is like some of this stuff just doesn't trickle down. Anyway, thank you for being here. I'll see you on Monday. Have a great week. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Agileth. Marcel, you'll get your feedback soon.